Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you the Western Front from the British perspective. And now we're going to discuss the actual fighting. We've got to that part in the lesson now. We're going to learn what actually the fighting was like for the British soldiers, what the general experience was. I think I always want to highlight this as a student introduction to the content. There is always more to read on this topic. So, of course, do bear that in mind if you're here as a first time and long time listener. But there will be chances always to practice our historical skills, and of course, key contextual knowledge can be gathered and used from this. So, with that in mind, notes and pads at the ready, and we shall begin. So, of course, we get ourselves straight into the actual combat, what it was like, and I really want to make it very important that we're aware. This is an overview of the experience throughout the war, mostly from 1915 all the way up to 1918. When we get on to our lessons concerning the actual specific battles in the conflict that we're going to study, we'll get more hyper-specific then on what the actual experience was like at those key moments, like at the Somme, like at Ypres, Amiens, and so forth. So before we do get on to that, it's important to get a general grounding. What was it like? What was the general experience? So fighting in the trenches, as we said in our previous videos, the army had to adjust to new fighting techniques because the movement, the idea of a war movement, had completely failed. And so it now became a series of gun attacks and counterattacks. Enemy trenches were the targets of artillery, rifle, and machine guns fire. Because they were targets, it was very dangerous. We have here the creation of the parapet that the frontline soldier would look through and could see out the top what, of course, they could see on the horizon. But it was just simply too dangerous. If they put their head above the parapet, if they dared to stand above this line, it was very likely that you would be shot by snipers in the distance. And of course, some trenches at the front line were quite shallow, really. They were about no more than 2 meters deep. So, particularly taller soldiers, if they stood on sentry duty, went above that fire step, just even to just rest their rifle, they of course could be shot at and killed. So, of course, periscopes were a much safer option for them. Another part is the British High Command were anxious that troops should not become passive. So, between their major offensives, the officers were commanded to lead trench raids. These trench raids would be conducted by a raiding party who would sneak into the enemy trenches. They would hurl grenades or take prisoners to gather any sort of intelligence. These face-to-face confrontations were fought with bayonets, spades, knives, and clubs. And actually, these were essentially preparations to prepare them for these next major offensives as they tried to seek a breakthrough, or at the very least, a break in. When carrying out frontal assaults across no man's land, they would be typically in wave formation. They'd be in lines, and these waves would leave the trenches. And at first, the British would walk with them rather than run, because of course they believed that their artillery was quite strong, quite powerful, and they could have some pretty easy gains. When we get onto the Somme offensive, we're going to find this was a misconception that really did not pay well for the British at the time. But a general trend that came about, regardless of when they were on offense or defense, was how little ground was actually gained. They would be fighting, thousands of men would die for a few hundred meters at most of land at any one time. The soldiers, as we said, would sleep and eat in terrible conditions, whether in rain or mud, and sanitation was indeed very basic. Even to have the simple luxury of washing up was a luxury. As we said, rats were, of course, everywhere, and sometimes the rats would be massive because it's a grim image to think of. But when soldiers died, many of them would be left in no man's land. It was too dangerous to go out and give them proper burials, take them back. Truces became a rare thing after the winter of 1914. And another condition they suffered with was trench foot. It was a serious problem for them, and eventually British orders had to change to make the soldiers change their socks at least 3 times a day just to stop the trench foot setting in. Combat stress also became quite common. At the time, it was considered things called shell shock or neurasthenia, because of course mostly associated with the artillery barrages that were bombing, and particularly when they were underground in the safer bunkers, they'd be quite loud, quite shocking, and would of course psychologically disturb them. In modern times today, this is more commonly seen as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but the understanding of mental health at the time was archaic, to put it politely. And so it's important to bear that in mind what these soldiers were going through and the lack of support they had along the way. All in all, though, this was the general situation for the British, the general experience that they had to face. That's our general overview, but I think it's now important to go into a deeper dive of other technologies that the British had to face as well, what their general experience was. So, two major weapons of warfare that were developed and used a lot for the British during the First World War are tanks and machine guns. We'll start with the machine guns first. Now, machine guns have been around for many decades. They'd actually infamously or famously, depending on who you ask, have been used very successfully in the American Civil War. But many people consider the First World War as the place when it really came to the fore and was used on a worldwide scale and became quite famous and quite popular. Now, why was this such a brilliant weapon for them to gather and use? Well, because apart from trenches, the troops were exposed in open land, and machine gun fire, with its rapid rate, would be quite deadly. There were two main principal guns the British used. One of them was called the Lewis light machine gun. This was typically carried by one man and could be used in attacks as well as defense. However, it was the heavier Vickers gun that actually became more popular as the war came on. It was lighter and easier to carry, and of course, seen as a more convenient and better weapon. Actually, infamously, is that 10 Vickers guns in one battle in the summer of 1916 fired 1 million rounds in just 12 hours. It actually fought off many attacks from German advancing companies. Its defensive prowess was simply unmatched at the time, especially because the soldiers were so exposed on the front and they had no real defense against it. Another interesting thing to note as well is that these Vickers guns rarely failed of that occasion in the summer and actually known at the Somme. There were no failures reported across the use on the day, and so they became quite reliable. However, they were still difficult to make, and even by 1918, the Lewis gun had a significant numerical advantage. For every three Lewis guns, you would probably have one Vickers gun in any battalion at the time. Regardless, though, they were able to fire 550 rounds a minute, and of course, be mobile was an ideal thing the machine gun gave the British, and hence they became quite popular. That's important to remember. The main difference is that the Lewis gun was a lighter, more offensive used weapon, while the Vickers gun, while heavier, had a stronger rate of fire, more reliability, and could be used quite well in defense. In effect, the machine gun became even more popular than the rifle. One notable statistic is that in 1914, a typical infantry regiment would have 12 times as many rifles as machine guns, but by 1917, the ratio was more akin to 2 to 1, showing that as the war went on, the army saw they were a very effective weapon and should be made quite heavily. There are reports that when he became commander in chief, Douglas Haig eventually saw light to, of course, the popularity of machine guns and made sure that actually every battalion had one, even when previous standards did not. However, there was another weapon that became, some would say, even more famous than the machine guns during the war, and that was the tank, one of them illustrated here on the left side of the screen. Now, tanks, they were quite a notable thing. These, unlike machine guns, were a truly new weapon for the conflict. The British actually developed them first and made sure to make good work of them. The first tanks were tracked armored vehicles. They were fitted with armament. A notable thing to establish right away is the tanks had genders. And of these genders, this one here on the left is actually a male tank, distinguished by its cannons on the left, and you can't see it, but on the right hand side as well. And so the idea was the male ones had cannons, whereas the female ones typically had machine guns. They had the Lewis and Vickers guns attached to them, and that's what their use was for. The tanks were a relatively late addition into the war. They only joined the conflict proper on the battlefield in September 1916 when deployed at the Somme. But they were the metal monsters of the war, and after many prototypes developed right back in June 1915, they became a very big staple, a very popular idea that was only growing as the conflict went on. In particular, the one shown here, the Mark IV, is a turning point. Now, it travelled at 4 miles per hour, which sounds quite slow by our modern standard with how fast our cars, how fast we know tanks can go today. But it was a powerful thing. It was very notable, and the crew was quite sizable. It had four drivers and four gunmen within it. There were quite hot fumes inside, though. It was quite dangerous. If a pipe burst, you'd be full of steam and full of hot air, and of course, the fuel being used to power it. And the only holes it had were for periscopes. Can't really fully see maybe, but it push had your front line part, one in the back area, and that was the only way to be able to see out from the front. There are, of course, other variations of the tank as well. As said, we had the tracker prototype back in 1915. We had Little and Big Willie, made, of course, later on, became the true, genuine prototypes in the war. But the Mark One that was first deployed at the Somme in September gave way to many more, the Mark II, the Mark III, the Mark IV, and even a Mark V that was deployed and was seen as much better and quite successful. It made great rounds at a battle in Amiens in 1918 and during the rest of the Hundred Days Offensive. But you had smaller tanks as well, notably the Whippets, who were used for quick movements. They had smaller crews of 2 to 3, and they could travel up to 8 miles per hour. Shockingly fast speed. It was very effective indeed. Of course, it wasn't just the British who had these, the Germans made use as well. They were a bit slow to it, but they had the Sturm Panzerwagen, and these essentially was their equivalent, much bigger. They had 16 crewmen that could travel at 8 miles per hour as well. But they, of course, lacked materials to make them in mass bulk, and it actually became popular for the Germans to actually capture the British weapons instead when they could take them down, and actually to reuse their materials, because the simple truth was, when we get to the likes of 1917 and 1918, Germans were not well supplied. As the war went on, though, the tank became even more popular. As I say, became a key drive for how something called combined arms became so effective when we get to 1918. There we are. That brings this series here to a close. This has been, as I say, our big overview on, of course, the experience of the British on the Western Front. Again, just an overview. As I say, we'll get into the more detailed encounters in all the various battles in later lessons in this series. But as always, we've got to use our historical knowledge now. Taught you a lot on these past few videos we've done, and I want us to consider these key questions. As always, do let me know your responses in the comment section below. Well, first off, for yourself, what were some key transformations you noticed as we started with that war of movement in late 1914, and now we see these new technologies that are created as we get into 15 and later on in the war? Technology, I've noted, of course, two deep dives for you there, the machine guns and tanks. Are there other things that you may have noticed came into play? Any new ideas, any new tactics for how they were, of course, responded into, how they actually dealt with the conflict? And the British government as well. How did they respond to this crisis, this stalemate, and how did they adapt? I think of those ideas there. What was brought in? What was seen as some of the solutions? And indeed, as we go into our later battles, our more specific campaigns in the series, just remember for yourself, we go forward with that. How has the war changed so much, even as early 1915 may seem? But I think we've had a roughly 6 months of conflict for the British, August into February of the previous year. And of course, consider for yourself how the conflict has already transformed for the British. We're only in 1915. The last battle we, of course, considered in detail was Ypres and Mons on the Marne. But now here we are in 1915. How are things going to rapidly change? I've teased a few things there. I've mentioned places like the Somme. I've mentioned Amiens, combined arms, the use of tanks and machine guns. But how are they going to transform even further? Has the biggest transformation already happened by early 1915, or is more going to occur? Let me know in the comments below how you found today's class and today's session, and of course, this overview series as a whole. This is our final part before we get into our major campaigns. Thank you as always for watching. This has been History with Sire. Hope you found it insightful, and I look forward to seeing you in my class again. Thank you.